My name is Renata Ostrowski, and I was 36 the year I found out which people in my life were made of paper and which ones were made of something sturdier. It started with a phone ringing at 11:40 at night, in a hallway that smelled like hand sanitizer and burnt coffee, 90 minutes from the house where my two sons were sleeping alone for the first time in their lives. My daughter June was 7, and a doctor I had known for 6 hours was using the words renal failure like ordinary words a person could say out loud on a Tuesday. I needed someone in my house before morning. I had exactly one number I thought I could call, and I want to tell you what the person on the other end said to me, because I've never repeated it until I started writing this down. It wasn't even the worst thing I heard that week. My ex-husband's new wife had a worse one waiting 2 days later. And what I did with all of it, a year afterward, standing on my own front porch, none of them saw that coming either. Some doors you spend years knocking on. Some you finally get to close yourself, on your own terms. Welcome back, Calm Story Times, where we sit with the quiet ones, the ordinary people, the impossible choices, the nights that split a life into before and after. If you've ever needed your family and heard only silence back, this one's for you. Stay until the end, because the part that matters most doesn't happen in that hospital corridor. It happens a year later, at my door, when the people who said no came knocking themselves. Drop a comment, and subscribe if you haven't yet. For most of my life, needing something from someone felt like admitting the whole structure was built on sand, so I didn't do it. I raised 3 kids, June, and my sons Isaac and Ren, in a rented duplex with a kitchen too small for all of us at once, and I paid for it the only way I'd learned how, which was numbers. I did bookkeeping for small businesses out of a spare room, a landscaping company, a dance studio, a man who sold restored bicycles out of his garage. I liked the work because a ledger either balances or it doesn't. There's a comfort in that. June used to sit under the folding table with a dead calculator, pretending to do her own invoices. Isaac, 7 then, thought the whole business was boring and said so often. Ren, 4, liked pressing buttons on the adding machine and listening to it chirp. We didn't have much, but our days had a shape that held us up: drop off at 7:45, invoices until midnight, lunches packed before bed so nobody was rushed. I told myself that if I planned hard enough, there was nothing life could hand me that I couldn't absorb alone. I budgeted for groceries, for the dentist 3 months out, for the inevitable flat tire, the inevitable field trip fee. The one line item I never planned for was needing a second adult in the house. My ex-husband, Callum, had left when Ren was still in a crib, and after that I just got more efficient, the efficiency you develop when there's no one else to catch what you drop. People at pickup called me tough. For years I thought that was a compliment. I understand now it was also a way of saying they didn't expect anything of themselves on my behalf. There's a difference between carrying weight and carrying it alone, and I'd spent a decade refusing to learn what that difference cost. That November, the cost finally came due. June had been tired for weeks in a way that didn't match her. She was the kind of kid who ran everywhere, who negotiated bedtime like a union rep. The tired wasn't like her, and neither was the swelling around her eyes I kept blaming on allergies, and neither, eventually, was her color. Her pediatrician looked at her for 4 minutes and told me to drive to the children's hospital tonight. I remember standing in the exam room doing math that had nothing to do with numbers. How long until someone could watch the boys? How long until I'd know anything at all? By midnight, a nephrologist with kind, exhausted eyes was telling me June's kidneys were failing, that we were looking at immediate dialysis and, likely, eventually, a transplant. She used the phrase long haul the way doctors do when they want you to understand something is serious without watching you fall apart. The hospital's pediatric nephrology unit was 90 minutes from our house, and June needed a parent at the bedside, which meant me, because there was no one else it could mean. Here's the part nobody warns you about when you're self-employed. There's no employer required to hold your job, no bank of paid leave quietly accumulating in the background. Every hour I sat in that hospital was an hour I wasn't invoicing, and I already had 2 clients who'd get twitchy if I went dark for a day or 2. The math was simple and brutal. I needed to be in 2 places 90 minutes apart, with one body to do it, and two little boys who could not be left to manage themselves. I sat in the parking structure that first night with the engine off, watching the fuel needle, and then I did the thing I'd promised myself I would never do. I started a list of people to call. There was exactly one name at the top. My mother's name is Deborah. She had me at 24, and she has never once let the subject drop of what that cost her, the dental hygiene degree she didn't finish, the year she spent, in her words, trapped before my father finally proposed. She kept an emotional ledger the way I kept a financial one, except hers never balanced in my favor. I knew this in my body before I even dialed, which is maybe why my hands were shaking, standing in a stairwell that echoed everything back at me twice. I kept it short, the way you do when you already suspect the answer but owe it to yourself to ask anyway. June was in the hospital. It was serious. I needed someone at the house with the boys, even just mornings, until I could figure out something more permanent. There was a silence long enough that I heard my own pulse. And then my mother didn't say no. She did something worse. She started asking questions that weren't really questions: how long this would go on, whether I'd really thought things through having 3 kids on a bookkeeper's income, whether I planned to keep leaning on others forever instead of getting, in her words, a real job with benefits. I stood in that stairwell and felt myself getting smaller, the way you do when someone you've spent your life trying to earn approval from hands you a verdict instead of a casserole. "Mom, her kidneys are failing," I said. "I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for someone to be in the house while my sons are asleep." My mother took a breath I recognized instantly from childhood, the one that comes right before she says the thing she's been holding behind her teeth for a while, sometimes years. I gripped the stairwell railing and braced for it the way you brace for a wave you can already see coming. What she said was, "You made your choices, Renata. Don't ask us to live inside them." I didn't answer right away, because the sentence kept unfolding, getting larger the longer I held it. I had made my choices. As though June's kidneys had taken a vote. My mother kept talking, the way she does when silence frightens her, listing reasons this wasn't her responsibility. She and my father were retired, they had their bridge group, their garden, a river cruise deposit that was, she made sure to mention, non-refundable. I could hear my father behind her, the television murmuring, and the specific silence of a man who has decided that saying nothing is the same as staying clean of it. He didn't get on the phone, and didn't call back. For 30 years I had watched him fold himself smaller behind whatever my mother decided, and told myself he was simply gentle. That night I understood gentle was just the word our family used so we wouldn't have to use the real one. I said, "Okay," and I don't fully know why, except that a person can only stand in a stairwell asking for so long before the asking costs more than the help would have been worth. I hung up, drove the 90 minutes home in the dark, and let myself into a quiet house where my sons were sleeping safely only because I'd paid the college kid 2 doors down $40 I didn't have to spare. I sat on the hallway floor outside their room for a long time. I did not cry. I started a different list. We had a family group text my mother had set up years earlier and named the Ostrowskis, with a sunflower emoji, back when she still wanted people to believe we were that kind of family. By that week it had become the place I watched my relatives choose everything except me. I sent a message the next morning, small and careful, the kind you write when you already suspect the answer but owe it to yourself to ask anyway. "June is in the hospital," I wrote. "It's serious, her kidneys. If anyone could take Isaac and Ren for an afternoon, it would help more than I can say." I watched the word change to delivered, then, hours later, to read. My mother had read it. My father had read it. My Aunt Corinne had read it. Nobody typed anything back. Not even the 3 dots. What my mother did do that afternoon was comment on a cousin's beach photos with 3 exclamation points, and react to a banana bread post with a laughing emoji. She was awake. She was reachable. She was making real-time decisions with her thumbs, and none of them involved her granddaughter's kidneys. I learned that week that a read receipt is its own kind of answer. It just doesn't have the decency to use words. I put my phone face down on the cafeteria table beside a coffee I couldn't taste and told myself there was one more call I hadn't made. The last name on my list was Callum. He is June's father, and Isaac's, and Ren's, in the technical sense biology insists on, even when nothing else in a person's behavior backs that up. He'd moved 40 minutes away 2 years after our divorce and married a woman named Sable. They had a new baby and a house I'd only seen in the background of photos other people showed me, because Callum had stopped showing me anything himself long before. I didn't want to call him. I called him anyway, because June is his daughter, and there are things you do even when your pride is screaming at you not to. Sable answered his phone. I could hear a television behind her and a baby fussing. I told her who I was, though she already knew. I told her June was seriously ill, that I needed to be at her bedside, and that I needed help, even a little, even a few afternoons a week, with the boys. There was a small laugh, the kind that isn't actually a laugh. Then Sable said the sentence I'd carry around for the better part of a year, delivered as lightly as a comment about the weather. Honestly, this is what happens when you have 3 kids on a bookkeeper's salary. Maybe sit with that. The line went muffled, like a hand had covered it. Then Callum came on for one sentence. Now isn't a good time for us, he said. We've got a lot going on too. I stood in a hospital corridor under a flickering light, holding a phone that had just told me, twice, that my children's emergency was an inconvenience to the 2 people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. I hung up, went back into June's room. She was asleep, and 4 taped to her hand. I sat down and let myself understand, for the first time, that no one was coming. Then I picked up the legal pad I always carried and started, out of sheer necessity, to plan. So I built a life out of duct tape and stubbornness, and for a while, barely, it held. My next-door neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Petrakis, started taking the boys most mornings before school. She refused every dollar I tried to hand her, so I started tucking cash inside her mail instead, folded into the church bulletin on her porch rail. The hospital's social worker, a soft-spoken man named Grant, got us a room in the family housing wing built for parents who couldn't afford a hotel and couldn't stand to drive home each night. I did bookkeeping in the hallway at 2 in the morning, laptop on my knees, while a dialysis machine hummed behind the door. Grant asked, gently, whether I had family who could spell me for even a day. I told him they were busy. I didn't explain, and he didn't push. There was a version of that month where I could have lied on the financial aid forms, inflated a few numbers, left out the trickle of client payments still coming in. I thought about it more than once at 2 a.m. with my banking app open. But I have a stubborn thing about honesty, even towards systems that had never been honest with me. So I told the truth on every form and took only what the truth entitled me to. It was never quite enough. I sold my second car, cancelled June's dentist appointment and mine, and learned which gas station ran 4 cents cheaper per gallon, and planned my route around it like it mattered, because it did. Every night, before I let myself sleep in the recliner, I checked my phone one more time. The thread stayed silent. Eventually I stopped being surprised, which is its own quiet grief, arriving early, before the real one shows up. The nephrology floor runs on its own clock. The day turns on lab draws and vitals checks and the long hush between 3 and 5 in the morning, when the hallway empties and you can hear the building breathing. That was when I did most of my writing, the invoices, and then, slowly, other things. One of those nights, a nurse stopped at the edge of the light spilling out of June's doorway. Maybe 55, reading glasses pushed into gray streaked hair, a badge that read Nadia. She looked at the legal pad on my knees, at the spreadsheet glowing on my laptop that I clearly wasn't reading. She didn't ask what I was doing there at 3 in the morning. She just said, "There's pudding in the family fridge nobody touches. Butterscotch. Go eat one before you give yourself a crick in your neck." That was the whole conversation. No advice about family, no sympathetic head tilt. I'd developed an actual allergy to that head tilt by then, the way people aim pity at you like it's a favor. Nadia didn't do that. She came back 20 minutes later with 2 puddings and set one beside me without another word, then ate the other standing against the doorframe, watching the hallway like we were 2 people on the same long shift. Inside the room, June was awake, propped against her pillows, bossy even sick, running a video call with her brothers. "Isaac, hold it higher, I can't see your face," she ordered. "Ren, that tower's going to fall." She was the kind of older sister who could run an entire household from a hospital bed with a dialysis line in her arm. I didn't yet understand how much Nadia was going to matter in my life. That night I thought she was just the nurse with the pudding. I was wrong, thankfully, in the good direction. I became 2 mothers that month. Mornings, I drove home to make pancakes and answer Isaac's questions, asked every day in the patient way of a child convinced adults must have answers if you just asked enough. When was June coming home? Would she be back for his birthday? I gave him the truth in pieces small enough to swallow, which is its own quiet lying, and I hated it every time. Ren, 4, didn't ask anything. He just got clingy, wrapping around my leg every time I left, and one morning he bit my forearm hard and sobbed like the world had ended, and I sat on the kitchen floor holding him until we were both late for everything. Afternoons, I was the bedside mother, reading the same chapters of the horse rescue book June loved, because the medication made her forget she'd heard them, and she never once complained. Around the middle of that month, I tried my mother once more. Not a call, I couldn't survive another. Just a text, off the group thread. "Mom," I wrote. "I'm barely holding this together. Is there any way at all?" The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. My heart lifted, stupid and hopeful, before I could stop it. Then the dots disappeared. No message ever came. I sat in the parking structure afterward and realized I'd stopped listening, days earlier, for a car pulling into our driveway that might be my parents finally showing up. You don't notice the moment hope leaves. You only notice, later, that the listening has gone quiet. That's its own grief, and it arrives before the real one does, like weather ahead of a storm. That week, I made the mistake of scrolling the family thread. My mother had posted after all, not to me, into the group. A photo from her garden club, a dozen women in pastel cardigans around a long table, a banner reading spring luncheon. My mother in the center, laughing, holding a glass of something pale. Caption, "So blessed by my girls." 40-something likes. I stared at it longer than I should have. A small gray timestamp at the bottom snagged in my mind and wouldn't let go, the way a splinter you can't see still announces where it's lodged. I didn't chase it down that night. June needed her evening medication, and exhaustion wins out over splinters. But it sat inside me, waiting. I'd come back to it soon enough. I wish now that I hadn't. A few nights later, June spiked a fever that emptied the room of calm and filled it with people in gloves, moving fast. Her numbers climbed in a way the monitor didn't like, alarms sounding in a pattern the nurses' faces reacted to before they said a word. For nearly 2 hours, the word nobody was saying sat in that room with us anyway. I needed someone, anyone, at my house, because if this turned into the worst version of itself, I couldn't leave June's side to drive 90 minutes home, and I couldn't bear the thought of my sons waking to a stranger, or to nothing. I called my mother at 11:40. It rang and rang to voicemail. I didn't leave one. By morning, June had stabilized, and I was left hollow with the kind of relief that feels like grief's close cousin. It was that same morning, back in family housing with cold coffee and my son safe because Mrs. Petrakis had picked up on the first ring, that I finally chased down the splinter. I opened the thread. I found the garden luncheon photo. I looked closely at the timestamp. It had been posted at 11:41, 1 minute after I'd stood over my daughter's bed, dialing my mother, listening to it ring into nothing. Below it, I found Sable's public story from that same night, dinner out with candles, 2 glasses clinking, caption date night, a small red heart. Same hour. Same earth. My daughter's fever climbing, and the 2 women who could have come were holding drinks up for a camera instead. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I set the phone down on the bedspread very gently, the way you'd set down something you suspected might shatter. And I made a decision I'd been circling for weeks. I stopped asking. Not out of pride, out of arithmetic. You cannot keep withdrawing from an account that has never once held $1 for you. After that morning, something in me went quiet and clear. I stopped spending what was left of my heart on people who weren't coming, and put all of it into the one who was still fighting to stay. The weeks that followed were not what you'd expect. In their strange way, they were almost good. When you stop watching the door for a rescue that isn't coming, you finally see what's actually in the room with you. What was in the room was June. We painted her nails a different color on every finger because she couldn't commit to just one. We made her brothers laugh so hard over video calls that Ren once fell off the couch. We read the horse book, then a second one, and started a third. One evening Nadia came by after her shift, still in scrubs, and left something on the windowsill, a glass casserole dish with a blue lid, warm, a note rubber banded to it that said, "From the night staff." I'd learn later there was no night staff fund, it had simply been Nadia, and her own kitchen. We ate it together, June and I with real forks, Isaac and Ren joining over video from home. It was the first warm, home-cooked meal anyone had made for me in longer than I wanted to count. I washed the dish that night, meaning to return it. It sat by our door for weeks, because I kept telling myself I'd hand it back once things settled down. For a while, I believed they would. I didn't know yet how few of those weeks we had left. The treatment stabilized her, I want to be clear about that, because June did not lose that fight. But there was a stretch of nearly 10 days where none of us knew that yet, where the transplant list moved too slowly, her numbers moved the wrong direction, and the word critical got used by a doctor clearly trying hard to be kind about it. I won't walk you through the medical details. If you've been there, you don't need me to. What I'll tell you instead is who June was during those 10 days, because that's the part one get to keep. She stayed bossy. She stayed funny in a dry way that caught the nurses off guard. 2 days into the worst of it, she made me promise, with a seriousness that flattened me, that I would not let Ren eat the candy from her secret stash under her bed, because he didn't appreciate quality candy and would just chew it wrong. I promised her. I would have promised her the moon. She asked me strange, clear questions during those days, the kind kids ask when they've quietly gotten ahead of the adults around them. She asked if the surgery would hurt. I told her the truth, the doctors had medicine for that, and it wouldn't. She nodded like a manager approving a plan she'd half expected. Once, she caught me writing on my legal pad and asked, "Are you writing about me?" I hadn't told her I was, but kids notice everything. Sometimes, I told her. Mostly I'm glad, because it means I get to keep you on paper too. She thought about that. Then write the good parts, she said. The horsebook parts. Not the scary hospital parts. Okay, baby, I said. She closed her eyes, satisfied, and I understood she'd just told me, without saying it, that she knew exactly how serious this was, and had decided to manage me gently through it anyway. On the 11th day, a donor match came through, the kind of luck no family feels entitled to and every family in that unit is quietly praying for. The surgery took 6 hours. Nadia found me in the waiting room afterward, still in scrubs, and said only, "She's out. She's stable. Go see your girl." I don't remember walking down that hallway. I only remember June's face, groggy and pale and unmistakably hers, mouthing hi before she was even fully awake. I need to tell you about the week after the surgery, because skipping it would make this story stop being honest. Recovery is its own kind of hospital, slower and harder in a different way, because the adrenaline that had held me upright for a month finally had nowhere left to go. There was a night, maybe 5 days after, sitting at my kitchen table after the boys were asleep, when the exhaustion caught up all at once, and the future looked less like a thing I could plan for and more like a wall. I won't dwell on that night longer than it deserves. People who've stood in that particular dark already know where I'm pointing. What pulled me back was, of all things, a sound, the house going quiet at 2 in the morning, and into it came my sons breathing in the next room. Isaac's heavier breaths, Ren's quicker ones, out of sync the way they always slept. 2 boys who had a father who'd said now isn't a good time, and grandparents who'd watched the phone ring out. If they lost me too, they'd have no one steady left. I'd spent a month learning that the only person who reliably showed up for my children was me. So I decided, that night, to keep showing up. Not because I felt strong. Because they were breathing in the next room and I was theirs. A week after June came home from the hospital, thinner and paler but unmistakably herself, there was a knock at the front door. I almost didn't answer it. I assumed it was another neighbor with a casserole, because in our town grief and relief both arrive in foil pans. The knock came again, patient rather than pushy, and something made me get up. It was Nadia. Off shift, in regular clothes I'd never seen her in, jeans and a cardigan that made her look, for a moment, like somebody's actual aunt. In her hands she had two things. A casserole dish, glass, blue lid, twin to the one still washed but unreturned on my counter, because of course she'd made more than one. And a spiral notebook, plain, the cheap kind from the drugstore, price sticker still on the corner. She didn't come inside. She stood on the step and said, "I know it's not really my place." I told her it was about the only place left that was. She held the notebook out and said the sentence that turned my life sideways. "You were writing at 3 in the morning for a reason, even too tired to see straight. So keep writing it down. Even the parts you don't want to say out loud. Especially those." I took the notebook in both hands, standing on the same front step where, a year later, a very different group of people would come to knock. I didn't promise her anything that day. But something in my chest that had been clenched for a month loosened by exactly one notch. I didn't write that first night. I wrote the next morning, before the boys woke up, in pen instead of pencil. The first sentence was small and true and unremarkable to anyone but me: how June, at 4, once refused toast cut into triangles and insisted, with the full authority of a tiny tyrant, that it be squares only. I wrote it down because once I had one true sentence, I found the next one. I wrote the horsebook. I wrote the mismatched nail polish. I wrote the way she ran her brothers' lives from a hospital bed like a tiny, exacting general. I wrote the fever, the surgery, and the parts she'd told me to leave out, because she'd been 9 and, as it turned out, wrong about that one thing. I wrote the phone ringing into nothing. I wrote the garden luncheon photo and the candlelit dinner and the single minute between them. I wrote what Sable had said, word for word, because putting it down on paper was the first time I could look at it without flinching. I became two people again, but a different two this time. In the daytime I was a mother making pancakes, driving carpool, learning to be the only parent doing double duty for 2 boys and a recovering daughter. At night I was the woman with the pen. I want to be clear, I wasn't writing to publish anything. I was writing because it was the only way I'd found to breathe through what had happened. The pages piled up on the kitchen table, and slowly, without my full awareness, they started adding up into something with a shape. A few weeks in, Nadia mentioned a caregiver support group that met Thursday evenings at the library, in the back room with bad fluorescent lighting and unexpectedly good coffee. I almost didn't go. I went because Nadia offered to sit with the boys. The group was 7 or 8 people, a facilitator, a box of tissues nobody touched, because grief past a certain depth tends to run dry. Someone asked if anyone wanted to read something. My hand went into my bag before I'd decided anything, and I read them the toast, the squares, the tiny tyrant, all of it. When I looked up, the room was completely still. A woman across the circle, older than me, reached over and put a hand briefly on my wrist and didn't say a word. That was the first time my truth landed in front of strangers and they simply witnessed it, instead of explaining it away. The woman who touched my wrist was named Priscilla, and it turned out that before retiring she'd spent almost 30 years as an editor at a regional press, the kind who'd spent a career turning other people's difficult truths into pages people could hold and finish. She asked, over the surprisingly decent coffee, whether there was more than that one page. I told her there was a stack 1.5 inches thick. She asked if she could read it. I nearly said no, those pages were mine, and June's. But Priscilla had sat with something of her own. I never made her name, so I trusted her the way you trust someone who has stood in a version of the same fire. She read it over 2 weeks and told me plainly, without flattery, that it was a book and deserved to be one, and that she knew an editor who needed to see it. I want to be honest about what happened next, because the internet loves a story where a stranger reads your manuscript on a Tuesday and you're successful by Friday, and that is not what happened here. The first editor passed. So did the second. The third said the writing was strong but the subject would be a hard sell, a sentence I've since made peace with. It took nearly a year and a stack of polite rejections before a small press 2 states over finally said yes. The advance was modest enough I cried over it anyway, not the number, but because someone with no obligation to be kind had read the hardest year of my life and decided the world deserved to read it too. We titled the book from something June had said, half asleep on pain medication, about how the horses in her favorite book ran out of a burning barn looking more beautiful afterward, soot and all. She named it herself, without knowing it, Soot and All. It came out on a Tuesday, just over a year after her diagnosis. For 2 weeks it did what small press books typically do, which is almost nothing. Then a woman with a sizable following online, who'd walked a version of this road herself, posted about it, and something cracked open. It spread the way grief finds words for itself, hand to hand, mother to mother. It climbed onto a bestseller list, then another. Letters began arriving, dozens and then hundreds, from women who'd slept upright in hospital chairs while their own families stayed comfortably home, who'd been told to just deal with it, who had assumed, quietly, that they were the only ones. They were not the only ones. Neither was I. That, it turned out, was the entire point of writing any of it down. Here is the part that matters most for this story. I hadn't changed a single name in that book except June's own, which I kept, because she'd earned it. I told the truth about the phone ringing at 11:40 and going unanswered. I told the truth about the garden luncheon and the candlelit dinner and the 1 minute between them. And on page 180-something, anyone who bought the book could read the exact words my ex-husband's wife had said to me the week our daughter nearly died: "This is what happens when you have 3 kids on a bookkeeper's salary." A national reviewer pulled that line for the headline of her review, and it traveled everywhere the review did. Sable had said it once, certain no one beyond that phone call would ever hear it. Now it was being read aloud at book clubs in states she'd never visited. I never raised my voice about it. I never sent a single angry text. I had simply written down what was true and let a few 100,000 strangers become my witnesses after the fact. The family thread had gone silent almost immediately after June came home, and stayed that way for the better part of a year, which suited me fine. I'd moved it to the bottom of my messages and stopped checking it. Which is exactly why I noticed the night it lit back up. The book had been out 6 weeks by then, and apparently a reporter had reached out to my mother for a comment, which is how she first learned her granddaughter's near-death experience had become a story strangers were reading. Suddenly the thread had a pulse. My mother posted a photo of the cover with a little red heart and the caption, "So proud of my daughter." The same red heart she'd used on a banana bread post the week I'd been begging her for help. As if pride were something you could mail in late and still have it count in full. Then Sable left a public 5-star review. "Always knew she had it in her," it read. "Such a brave, talented woman." Sable, the same Sable who delivered the bookkeeper's salary line, was now praising the very book that contained that exact line, apparently without a shred of irony. I read it 3 times to confirm it was real. Not one message on that suddenly chatty thread mentioned June by name once. They had found the spotlight with impressive speed. They had not found the actual child at the center of it. I should have known, honestly, exactly what was coming next. It was a Saturday afternoon in early summer, about a year after that first knock from Nadia. We'd moved by then, nothing fancy, a small house at the end of a quiet street with a yard and a porch, and the porch matters here, because life has a sense of symmetry even when you'd rather it didn't bother. The boys were out in the yard. There was a knock, and when I opened the door they were all standing there together, my mother in her good wool coat despite the heat, my father a step behind her, hands in his pockets, and beside them, Callum and Sable, dressed like people who'd rehearsed this in the car. My mother held a bouquet, store-bought, cellophane crinkling in the breeze. For one long second I just looked at them, this delegation of people who had each, in their own way, told me no when a no could genuinely have broken something in me for good. The last person who'd stood on that step holding something out to me had been Nadia, with a notebook. This felt like the negative of that same moment, developed in reverse. My mother spoke first, her eyes already conveniently wet, the professional tears she'd always been able to summon on command. "Renata," she said. "We've all been doing a lot of thinking. We want to make things right. We're still family, no matter what's happened." Behind her, my father nodded at the porch boards without meeting my eyes. Sable arranged her face into something meant to read as warm. Callum looked past me into the yard at his own sons, the ones he hadn't asked to see in over a year, with the expression of a man checking whether an investment he'd walked away from had appreciated in value. I stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind me so the boys wouldn't overhear. What followed was the strangest sales pitch I've ever sat through, and I've written invoices professionally for over a decade. My mother led with the family material. Blood is blood. June would have wanted us together, using my daughter's near death as a closing argument, which I let her keep doing, because people tell you exactly who they are if you give them enough silence to do it in. Then it got more specific. A soft mention of the book, of how nice it might be if the next one included the good family memories, the holidays, as though there had ever been good holidays worth including. Then Callum offered, gently, that with everything going so well for me now, surely we could all be reasonable about helping one another out, family to family. And there it was. The word help, the exact word I'd spoken into a stairwell a year earlier, arriving back at me now from the people who had refused it when it actually mattered. Except now there was money in the room, which apparently changed everything about whether help was a thing families did for each other. Then Callum said the thing that quietly ended the conversation, though he didn't seem to realize it. He said he'd been thinking he ought to start seeing Isaac and Ren regularly again, that it wasn't right for a father to be cut off from his own sons. Beside him, Sable went very still, and something passed between them I recognized instantly, because I'd heard its exact echo a year earlier. "Now isn't a good time for us," he'd said then. "Us?" A full year of silence, and the first time it cracked, he flinched toward his wife instead of his own children. Whatever the arrangement between them had been, he'd let himself stay cut off from his living sons for a year and only wanted back in now that their mother had become somebody worth knowing again. The unfairness of that, aimed at my boys, was the one thing in the entire performance that genuinely moved me. Sable must have felt the temperature shift, because she stepped forward with her warmest smile and said, "Renata, listen, we never really meant that bookkeeper's salary thing. That was just a hard day for everybody." I almost admired the nerve required to say that to my face, on my own porch. Here's the thing that entire terrible year had taught me, the thing I'd put down page after page in a book strangers had actually read. You do not have to match someone's volume to win. The angrier and more unsettled they got, the quieter I went, because I no longer needed a single thing from any of them. A person who needs nothing from you is the one person you cannot control. I told them, evenly, that I appreciated them coming all this way, and that the answer was no. No to the next book. No to the holidays. No to family help. My mother's professional tears dried up remarkably fast once they stopped working on me, and the real feeling underneath came out instead, which was rage. "After everything I sacrificed for you," she said, her voice climbing, "you're going to stand here and abandon your own mother?" Abandon. The woman who had watched my texts go unanswered for weeks was accusing me of abandonment on my own front porch, in broad daylight, with a full straight face. Sable started in too, talking fast now about how unfair I was being, how I was punishing an entire family for one hard conversation, how I'd put their private business into a book just to humiliate them publicly. The two of them got louder and louder, talking over one another, and I simply stood there, calm, my back against my own front door, letting them show me, on a Saturday afternoon in broad daylight, exactly what they had already shown me a year earlier over the phone. Callum said nothing at all, the entire time. Callum always says nothing. And my father, my quiet father, who had spent an entire lifetime folding himself smaller behind whatever my mother decided for both of them, did something he had genuinely never once done in my presence. He looked up from the porch boards. He looked directly at me, and his eyes were wet, and this time he didn't look away first. "Renata," he said, his voice cracking on my own name. I should have, and then he simply stopped. The rest of the sentence just hung there in the warm summer air, too heavy for him to finish lifting after 60-some years of practice at lifting nothing at all. For one long second I saw the whole sad shape of him clearly, a man who had always known exactly what was happening, and had chosen silence so many times over the years that the silence had eventually become the only language he had left available to him. Then my mother said his name, sharp, Walt, and he closed his mouth and stepped back into place beside her. He chose her again. He would, I understood then, always choose her. That was, somehow, the saddest single thing that happened on that entire porch, and I let it be sad, and it changed absolutely nothing about my answer. When they had finally worn themselves out, when the yelling had nowhere left to go, the porch went quiet, and the quiet belonged entirely to me, because I was the only person standing there who wasn't afraid of anything anymore. I looked at my mother and said the one true sentence I had carried since the night of that fever, the only sentence that had ever really mattered. I gave her everything I had, I said. Every hour, every dollar, every ounce of myself, while the four of you decided it wasn't your job to give anything at all. So there's nothing left over here for any of you. I'm not keeping it from you out of spite. There simply isn't any left. Then I turned back to my mother and handed her own words back to her, the ones that had echoed in my head for over a year, the ones that had ended up on page 1 of the book itself. You told me I made my choices, I said, and that I shouldn't ask you to live inside them. You were right about one thing. I did make a choice. I chose these boys, and I chose their sister, and I chose to actually show up. So here's the real difference between us. I made my choice, and I won't be asking you to live inside it either. My mother opened her mouth and, for what may have been the first time in my entire life, found absolutely nothing waiting inside it to say. Last, I turned to Sable, who was still working hard on finding the right expression, still hunting for the smile that might finally crack me back open. You want to know what I really think? I asked her, and she leaned in slightly, hungry for it. I think you can read it the same as everybody else did. It's on page 184. Then I opened my own front door, stepped back inside my own house, and closed it gently behind me. No slam. A slam is a thing you do when you still have something left to prove, and by then, I genuinely didn't. Through the door I could hear my mother's voice rising again, and then fading, as my father, I think, finally steered her back down the porch steps toward the car. Out in the yard, through the window, Isaac was pushing Ren on the tire swing that hung from our one good tree, and neither of them had heard a single word of what had just happened on the other side of the house. That was the only thing on this entire earth I actually cared about protecting that day. I had protected it. I went out the back door and pushed my sons on that swing for the better part of an hour. They never came back. There were a handful of messages on the family thread over the following weeks, my mother cycling through wounded, then furious, then wounded all over again, and then even that eventually went quiet. I never blocked the number, and I never deleted the group entirely. I simply turned the notifications off. There's a real difference between slamming a door shut and quietly stepping away from one for good, and that year taught me, finally, how to tell the two apart. Life got smaller and considerably warmer after that, which turned out to be the only direction I'd ever actually wanted it to move in. The royalties from Soot and all did something for me I had never once had the luxury of in my entire adult life, which was room to breathe. Not extravagance, just room. I opened accounts in my son's name so that no child of mine would ever again be told, by anyone, that there simply wasn't enough to go around. I kept the small house with the good climbing tree. I kept writing, mornings now instead of 2 in the morning, still in pen, because some habits, once they're finally working properly, are worth leaving alone. Nadia became something I still don't have a tidy, simple word for. She comes for Sunday dinner most weeks. Isaac calls her by her first name, and Ren calls her Grandma Nadia, which she allows without comment, and which, the very first time I overheard it, sent me straight out of the room so nobody would catch my face doing what it was doing. One Sunday, a little over a year after that porch confrontation, I finally did the thing I'd been meaning to do since the very first night in family housing. I took the casserole dish, glass, blue lid, the one that had sat by one door and then another through the entire worst stretch of my life, and I washed it until it shone, and I filled it with something I'd cooked myself, and I handed it back to Nadia across a table set with good light and 4 places, one of them kept permanently for the girl who'd named the book without ever meaning to. From the night staff, I told her, handing it over, and Nadia laughed, the real kind, because we both already knew there had never actually been any night staff fund at all. There had only ever, in the end, been her. There had only ever been the people who actually showed up. That's who gets to sit at my table now. The dish goes back and forth between the two of us these days, full in both directions. That, as it turns out, is what family actually is. A warm dish that keeps making its way back to you. I used to believe family meant the people who shared your blood. I buried that particular idea somewhere around the same time my daughter was fighting for her life in a hospital bed 90 minutes from home. Here's what I believe now instead. Family is whoever shows up at 11:40 at night when you have absolutely nothing left to offer them in return. And the ones who only ever knock once things have gotten easy again don't get to come inside. Not anymore. Not in my house. That's my story. One daughter who is, thank God, still here to roll her eyes at me across the dinner table most nights. One nurse who knocked on my door when I had nothing left at all. And 2 boys who slept safely in the next room on the one night that mattered most, because someone, finally, chose to stay. If someone in your life keeps showing up for you, tell them today, before you're ever forced to learn the hard way exactly who would and who wouldn't. If this story stayed with you at all, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe for the next one. I'll see you there.